Yeah. Just a heads up, we are recording this session as we do for all our sessions, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, welcome everyone. I am kind of pleased to announce this session that we'll have today on the embodied carbon requirements and essentially where we're going with the National Building Code when it comes to carbon. Just to introduce myself, I am Mohammed Haq. I am part of the steering committee here at CLF. And for my day job, I am the sustainability manager at Mattamy Homes. So I oversee all our low carbon building design. And yeah, this has been very top of mind for us as to where the code is going, what we're doing internally, and with increasing conversations about affordability, how can we, drive our carbon standards forward while keeping that in mind. So having said that, we are joined by our three expert panelists, Haley Martin from the National Research Council. She has been instrumental in the Canadian code harmonization conversations in the past, and she will be able to talk about that in details and what has happened so far. Ryan Zizzo is here from Mantle Climate. He is leading the conversation around incorporating embodied carbon into the National Building Code, which is coming up in 2030. So we will hear from him regarding that. And Brian Purcell's here from the Atmospheric Fund, and he has done, like the Atmospheric Fund has done a lot of work on figuring out what emissions factors and emissions look like in Ontario and how we sort of align or these days not align with the National Building Code when it comes to carbon. So we'll talk about that as well. Before we get started, let me see if this works. Okay, cool. Of course, since we are based in Toronto, I wanted to acknowledge that we are on traditional territory and are covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. And just to give you guys an intro to the Carbon Leadership Forum, because a lot of you guys are joining us for the first time. So we are this global forum that started at the University of Washington a long time ago. And the goal of this is really to have a hub for everything that relates to embodied carbon in the building sector and helping basically all stakeholders involved with that to collaborate with each other and sort of scale our efforts because we realize that when we're in a silo, all these things are difficult and very expensive, just to be blunt. But however, as excuse me, as we scale up our efforts and make certain nice to haves a requirement, things suddenly start making sense. And we have seen a lot of benefits that come out of that. We provide a lot of resources for embodied carbon analysis in buildings. We provide a lot of policy documents, and we have this resource hub that is really great for anyone to take a look at who are thinking about embodied carbon, which if you're here, I think it's everyone in this group. Um, we love for people to get involved. We need volunteers all the time. We need experts because there's only so much that, like 10 or 12 of us can do in the steering committee. So we've had a lot of great experts in the past and currently guide us. So if you would like to get involved, please feel free to email us at info@clftoronto.com. And clftoronto.com is our website where you can kind of check out everything that we have. Um, just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Huda from RWDI is my co-host. I should have introduced her before we got started, but she is another member of our steering committee, and she will be kind of helping us with tech support today. And she will be able to control your audio and video. We're asking all our participants to kind of keep it turned off. And if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and Huda can help unmute you, and you can go ahead with that. So meanwhile, also feel free to pop in questions in the chat. We'll keep a close look and make sure we address them, and we'll have a Q&A session in the end of the presentation as well. So that's my last slide. And before we get started, just wanted to quickly pause and ask if anyone has any initial questions. Going once, going twice. All right, I think we are good to begin. So I will stop sharing my screen
I
and
think just right before that, I'm
go
just
ahead.
gonna put a poll out for everybody. If you can
Okay.
just take a moment to answer it, that'd be great.
I always forget about the poll.
That's okay.
So the poll just asks what industry you're from. It kind of helps us on the back end with statistics. So let's take a couple of minutes to fill out the poll, and we can maybe end it in 1 minute.
Valentine, yes, a copy of the recording will be available on our website and our YouTube channel.
Perfect. We'll give it a few more seconds for the poll. I see most of you have responded.
Everybody responded. We can get started.
Perfect. All right. Yep. Thanks, everyone. And I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it off first to Haley to talk about where we are right now with the National Building Code and the Model Code and what it looks like.
I've done something to my video. I can't turn it back on. It says I need a permission from the host, but in the meantime, I'll get my PowerPoint set up.
Do you want to try now? Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Okay, so let me just get the PowerPoint started here. I'm not sure which screen you're seeing. Sorry, give me 1 second to make sure you're seeing the correct screen.
We're seeing the presentation.
Screen.
Okay, it looks like you're not seeing my presenter view, so that's great. It was a little hard to tell on my end what you were actually seeing.
Yeah, it's a full screen slideshow.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to start with an introduction to the Harmonized Codes Development System. It's a lot of information, so I'm going to go through it as quickly as I possibly can. If you have any questions, please save them up. So to start harmonization, we transitioned to a new governance model in November 2022, which is depicted here. So the Canadian Table for Harmonized Construction Codes Policy consists of deputy minister level representatives from federal, provincial, and territorial governments. Their goal is to provide strategic policy direction and oversight for the development of the national model codes. I forgot I had animations. Then we have the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, or the CBHCC, who are federal, provincial, and territorial representatives. They oversee and are responsible for the development of the national model codes based on the strategic policy directions. The table and the board are the main decision-making bodies in this system. The Codes Board oversees several technical committees. Many of these are the National Model Codes Committees, who are doing the technical codes development work. These committees focus on technical topics that advance the strategic directions of the codes. They develop code changes, organize research, and engage in a lot of the focused technical discussions around the codes. The Codes Board also receives input from the Advisory Council for Harmonized Construction Codes, which is a tool to receive well-rounded feedback from industry, regulators, and other organizations. Finally, the board, the technical committees, and the Advisory Council all receive input from the general codes community, who can attend public meetings, submit code change requests, and submit public comments. These provide mechanisms for the general public to provide input at multiple stages of the code development process. And although not included in the diagram, I should mention also NRC's Codes Canada. We work behind the scenes to provide secretarial support as well as technical and policy advice at all levels of governance. So the harmonized code development process consists of the following steps. So first is the strategic direction setting. The strategic priority areas are set by the table based on advice from the CBHCC, who also considers advice from the Advisory Council. And the strategic direction is set in advance of the code cycle and informs work planning. Then we have work planning. So the CBHCC, with input from the Advisory Council, translates the strategic direction into actionable code development priorities to inform the development of a work plan for the code cycle. And the work plan is approved by the CBHCC in advance of the code cycle, and they're currently working on the 2035 work plan. Then we have change development. So changes to the content of the codes are developed in accordance with the approved work plan. The objective is to develop consensus-based recommendations for the national model codes. This is where we are for the 2030 codes. Then we have public review and approval for publication. So broad consultation on proposed code changes is achieved through public review. The objective is to solicit comments from the code user community across the country through a nationally coordinated consultation. And finally, we have publication of the national model codes, as well as additional material to support effective implementation, such as users' guides. So the development committees. So the CBHCC is responsible for the content of the national model codes and related guides, and they strike development committees. So the development committees are given provisional responsibility for the relevant code content through their mandate. So they're each given a terms of reference that lists out what they're doing. And the development committees report to the CBHCC. So there is the Standing Codes Coordination Committee, which sort of functions as a hub for the code development technical activities. So there's coordination between different committees, et cetera. The National Model Codes Committees, this is one of the main ones that the public participates in. So these are, the membership of these is made up of volunteer experts that focus on specific technical topics. The National Model Codes Committees, or the NMCCs, also will have task groups and working groups, and this is where you really find the subject matter experts. There are also minor task working groups. These are created by the CBHCC, and the policy working groups, which work on the policy directions, and the membership is generally subject matter experts from the provinces and territories. So development committees prepare consensus-based recommendations. Consensus requires that all opinions be considered and weighed, and that any statement of agreement should be reached only after full and fair discussion of the issues involved. The CBHCC has developed a set of strategic priorities for the 2030 editions of the National Model Codes and has struck a number of NMCCs to address these topics. I won't go through the whole list, but you can find it on the CBHCC website. And just to note, the NMCC working on the GHG emissions requirements is the NMCC on climate change mitigation. So proposed changes, they're created by the NMCCs through subject-specific task groups generally. So proposed changes, this is, the main thing that we're doing here. So they include consideration of direction from the CBHCC, the issue to be addressed, supporting evidence, harmonization across the provinces and territories, impacts of introducing the changes to the codes, and enforcement implications associated with implementation of the changes. So once complete, but before going to the CBHCC, the proposed changes are sent to the Standing Code Coordination Committee in order to address coordination issues with proposed changes and to ensure that all potential consequences and implications on other code requirements have been considered. The CBHCC then considers proposed changes following the recommendations of the development committees. So public review. So once the CBHCC approves a proposed code change, it's sent to public review. Once the public review period closes, comments are sent to the development committees to draft resolutions. A recommendation is then made to the CBHCC. The CBHCC then, for all proposed code changes, usually decides to approve for publication. So there are lots of ways to get involved in the code development process. You start by visiting the website. There's all kinds of information on there. You can attend meetings. They're open to the public, so you can follow specific code changes. You can submit code change requests. You can comment on in public reviews, and you can also submit applications to volunteer on code committees. And there's also lots of documents on there. So that's the first big section here. That was, the sort of dry stuff. So the next thing I'll go through is the operational greenhouse gas emissions requirements that were introduced in the 2025 National Model Codes. So in order to meet provincial, territorial, and federal greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and climate action plans, including the goal to reduce Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, and to reach net zero emissions by 2050, requirements to minimize excessive operational greenhouse gas emissions were introduced in the 2025 editions of both the NECB and the NBC. The changes include a new objective and functional statement, changes to Division A, a flexible framework for enforcement of requirements to minimize excessive operational greenhouse gas emissions, and both performance and prescriptive compliance options. A new objective and functional statement was introduced in both the NECB and the NBC to minimize excessive GHG emissions. This new objective, OE2, states that an objective of this code is to limit the probability that, as a result of the design or construction of the building, the environment is unacceptably affected by excessive emissions of greenhouse gases. The functional statement, F101, was added to limit operational greenhouse gas emissions. Part 11 was added to the NECB to provide operational GHG emissions requirements applicable to Part 3 buildings. The operational GHG emissions requirements applicable to Part 9 buildings are provided in Section 936 of the NBC. New abbreviations related to operational greenhouse gas emissions were added in both the NECB and the NBC for carbon dioxide equivalent, gram, greenhouse gas, gigajoule, and kilowatt hour. So the overall goal is to reduce operational greenhouse gas emissions to zero or near zero across provinces and territories by 2050. To do this, a flexible framework is provided to regulate expected greenhouse gas emissions due to building operation by using levels that move towards lower operational emissions. Compliance is determined using a reference versus proposed building or house approach. The framework is based on GHG emissions performance levels, which are expressed as either a % operational GHG emissions target or as a % improvement, with level F being the minimum level of improvement moving towards level A, which is the highest emission reduction level and represents near zero emissions. The minimum regulated GHG level is selected by the province or territory responsible for enforcement. As these are performance requirements, compliance with any level can be achieved using any energy source, which we'll see on the next slides. So to comply with the requirements, the total expected annual greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed building in carbon dioxide equivalent is calculated for each energy source used by the building, then added together. To do this, the annual energy of each energy source is multiplied by the GHG emissions factor for that energy source. For example, you might use natural gas for space and service water heating and electricity for the regulated loads from fans and air conditioning. And the annual energy use is determined through energy modeling. How you determine your GHG emission factor, or GEF, for each energy source is established in the code requirements. So the first source of GHG emission factors is the provincial or territorial government having jurisdiction, or if permitted by the province or territory, by the regulated utility responsible for providing the energy source. Or as provided in the tables in the code, both in the NECB and in the NBC Section 936, or lastly, if the factor is not provided by any of the above, by a qualified person. So compliance of the proposed building or house with one of the GHG emissions performance levels A to F shall be determined by comparing the annual operational GHG emissions of the proposed building or house to the operational GHG emissions target of the reference building or house and meeting the enforced percentage reduction. Where the building cannot reasonably be connected to the provincial or territorial electrical power grid, compliance shall be achieved by reporting the annual emissions of the proposed building. So you might be asking how the reference GHG emission factors for space and service water heating were established. So the reference building's operational emissions target is based on a reference GEF as the basis for compliance. So the reference emissions factor was derived using the minimum equipment efficiencies in the codes, then adjusted using regression analysis so that the majority of archetypes meet the lowest GHG level, or level F, when using gas-fired equipment for space and service water heating. So available in the NBC Section 936 and applicable to Part 9 residential buildings, the prescriptive option to minimize excessive emission of operational greenhouse gases removes the need for modeling software and introduces a simpler method for determining compliance with the GHG performance levels. Compliance with any level is determined by the choice of space and water heating equipment, the GHG emission factor for electricity, which depends on the jurisdiction, and the minimum required number of energy conservation points that the house must meet. So energy conservation points are assigned to either the tiered energy efficiency prescriptive tiered packages in subsections 936.10 and 936.12, or in the energy conservation measures available in the prescriptive trade-off path in subsection 936.9. A table of available options to comply with each GHG emissions performance level is provided in the code. And as previously mentioned, the regulated GHG level is selected by the province or territory responsible for enforcement. As an example, the compliance options with GHG level F are shown on the slide. Any of the listed options for energy source or type of equipment will comply with GHG level F in most jurisdictions with no additional energy conservation points required, with the exception of using propane, as you can see on the slide here. Buildings that cannot reasonably be connected to a provincial or territorial electrical grid are exempt from compliance. And so that concludes my summary of the operational GHG emissions requirements in the 25 editions of the NECB and NBC.
Awesome. Thank you, Haley. Appreciate that. Learned a lot of things there. I think the two biggest ones are that the operational emissions, well, I guess the three biggest ones are one, the operational emissions kind of framework already exists on a national level and for all provinces that follow the National Building Code very closely. However, in Ontario, we're still a bit backdated where we still follow SB 10 rules. Well, the second thing is I like that you mentioned that everyone can be involved in these conversations. There's a lot of task groups, there's a lot of observer opportunities involved. So do check out the website. And there are a lot of acronyms that go around in the National Research Council. So thank you for explaining to us what those really mean. Having said that, I think if there are no questions currently on the chat, we will pass it off to Ryan to speak about what's coming up in our 2030 National Model Code, specifically on embodied carbon.
Thank you. Can you see my shared slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that, Haley. Lots of really interesting information there. I'm looking forward to the discussion after hearing from Brian as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 2030 code cycle that we're currently in, and specifically the Embodied Carbon Task Force that I am a member of, or task group rather. You can see on the slide, this is the list of task groups that are currently established and currently working under that GHG mitigation broader group. So as you can see, we are just one, the Embodied GHG emission task group is just one of 10 task groups here. You can see all the other task groups that have been established. So yeah, as you can see, this is quite a large initiative with lots of different experts on many different topics. But just wanted to kind of give a lay of the land that we are just one small part of this very large process. And some of these slides Haley did share, so I'm just going to skip over them, but just to show you, the task groups are a subcommittee of a subcommittee of a subcommittee, so we are a very small part of the larger discussion. One of the main things I wanted to make sure folks understand and know is that the task group does not set the direction for embodied carbon management in the code. We are given direction from the National Model Code Committee. It is our job to help implement that direction. So that was something that was interesting to a lot of the folks when they joined the committee. They thought that we were going to be kind of setting the direction and what we should be doing, but we were very specifically told what we were going to be doing, and it was our job to give technical recommendations on how to achieve that. So the direction is beyond our pay grade of the task group committee members. Wanted to just make sure that people knew that. So the public comment is really important because our job is not to change the direction of the policy direction. That's where the public comments come in. And we are really, one of the big things I want to get out of this session is to really invite folks on this call to join the meetings going forward and to be part of the public consultation going forward, because we really do need to hear from industry and the public on the policy direction. That's not something that the task group members can actually change. Sorry, lost my mouse there. Trying to move this slide forward.
I see your mouse on the slide.
Yeah, I don't know why I seem to be frozen. Let me stop sharing. We did it. Oh, it's like it was lagged and it moved forward a million slides at once. Sorry, guys. Share. Back to this. So this is the list of the current task group members. This is all public. It's on the website. There are agendas and meeting minutes for all of this. So these are all public documents that people can go and refer to. But I think it's important just for folks to know who's on the task group, who's part of the discussions, and also to be clear, I'm not leading the task group. I'm just one of the members. Namat Alpuche from CSA Group is the task group chair, and Haley is part of the task group as well as one of the the NRC support folks. But this, you can see this is the task group members. So we've got some good representation from some municipalities, including Zara Tashnizi, who's on the call. Hi, Zara, from City of Vancouver. We've got some folks from the NRC, including David and some consultants, so me and some folks from Europe and RJC. So a good cross section. We've got good geographic representation, but obviously, Canada is a very big place. There's a lot more places that aren't, on the task group calls. But I would invite folks, even if you're not on this list, to be an observer. This was one of the key things I wanted to let people know as well, that anyone can join these calls and be part of hear the discussion and even comment and speak during the meetings. There is a rule that the members are prioritized in terms of if we have a short period of time and a lot of people need to speak, it is the members that are prioritized, but typically we do have enough time for additional comments from observers. So I just, on this slide here, I copied the observers that we had at previous meetings, including folks like the Canadian Wood Council, the Cement Association of Canada. I know some of those folks are on the call today as well. Enbridge, ResCon. You can see lots of architecture firms, lots of players are on these calls and observing, and they do speak up and give their opinions, and it does influence the course of the call as well. So again, really want to invite people to join these calls if you're interested, because you can speak, you can be heard, and you can actually influence the direction or that the meeting and the committee ends up taking. I do have a slide of what the agenda package looks like. So if you sign up and you're getting something that looks like that with the green cover, you're looking at the right thing. That's what we look at. That's what guides the meeting. So again, inviting folks to be part of these discussions going forward. To get into some of the specifics about what the policy direction that this is before we get into the specifics, this is the timeline. This is what's happened so far. So in May and June of 2025 of last year, there were initial consultations on the development of the draft policy that was released publicly as a draft. They did collect feedback on the draft policy, and there was a wide range of feedback. And actually, just FYI, the task group members, me and my committee members, we didn't actually see that feedback. That all went to the broader policy direction folks. So we don't really have line of sight as to all the feedback that was received. We did get kind of a summary of some of the things that were said. And, obviously, as you would expect, there was a broad range of feedback that was shared with. Again, so I've been told, we didn't see them all specifically, but, some people said this should not be in the code. We did get pushback from some elements, some organizations. And so we heard that. And then, as you can expect, the other end of the spectrum, we had some people said this doesn't go far enough. We need to go further. We need to go faster. And then there was, things in the middle where tweaks were being suggested. So there was a very broad set of feedback that was given. Ultimately, the decision makers went back and did a update to the policy statement. The main thing is the policy remained, so that was a win, right? The fact that it wasn't removed from the proposed code updates, as some people would have liked to have seen. So the policy remained, and they did make some tweaks and some minor improvements. But generally speaking, I would say 90%, 95% of the draft policy that they issued did end up being in place, and they basically just made a few clarification points and tweaks. But the main draft policy did in fact survive the first public comment, and that's what we are working on going forward. And then in the bottom of the slide here in the underline, you can just see that there are public reviews scheduled in our agenda or in our timelines for spring of next year, 2027, about a year from now, and then the fall of 2027, and then spring of 2028, and then the official publication of these of this code update is planned for summer of 2028. So there's with 2 full years of work going to be going on this, and at least 3 or 4 public comment periods. So again, inviting people to pay attention, follow along, and provide your comments so that we can try to all be on the same page on these requirements, and it's not a shock for anyone when it comes into effect. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through the direction right now. In terms of what we're going to be looking at. So I've got a few slides. One is the life cycle phases and modules that are currently being targeted for inclusion. Right now, the idea or the direction is that it is A1 to A3 currently. So you can see here, we're not looking at A4 and A5, like the Toronto Green Standard currently looks at, and we're not looking at B and C, like LEED, I believe Vancouver and other policies look at. So this is a much simplified and reduced scope. That said, A1 to A3 is the majority of the emissions. So this does take into account the majority of emissions, but just to be clear that it is different than other current practices typically. In terms of the object of assessment, currently the direction says structure is to be included and potentially envelope. So again, this is many policies out there are structure and envelope as the core scope, that they are both required. I think we're still early days to say whether an envelope is going to be included as will be included in the end in this policy, or whether it will remain as an optional thing that's up to the project team. It's not clear yet, but the direction was very clear that definitely structure, and we're considering envelope. So that is the current direction. Of other things like finishes, fixtures, MEP, definitely not on the radar for this round of the code, but there are discussions about potentially having 2035, 2040, expanding the scope into latter or into additional scopes. So this is how that was kind of demonstrated or communicated in one of our previous committees, where we showed A1 to A3 just structure and then a dotted line around envelope of potential. And then the idea was future code cycles would expand both in terms of modules and temporal timelines covered, and the object of assessment and structural scope covered. I can understand the thinking behind this. The group did raise some concerns that this will cause shifting baselines, right? It's hard to compare A1 to C4 results of a building with a full material scope. It's hard to compare that to A1 to A3 only of structure, right? It's obviously not an apples to apples comparison. So while I can understand the approach that they're taking here, I think there are some concerns with that, and we might want to think through that a little bit more. One idea is to have sample placeholder estimates for all of the future scopes and materials, so that we're at least comparing an assumption of a full package of life cycle assessment impacts, but only having project-specific information for the A1 to A3 structure. So that's a discussion that's currently very active, and yeah, I would invite folks to weigh in on that and join the calls, give your thoughts, join the public comment periods. In terms of the performance evaluation metrics, this is the guidance in the policy statement. The idea is to definitely be looking at the percent better than reference, similar to what Haley described in the operational carbon approach. And then again, with an with an investigation currently into other potential metrics that could work as maybe optional metrics. Thinking about things like intensity metrics, like again, the Toronto Green Standard has an intensity metric, so of I think it's 350 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, right? So having a hard number, or the CAGBC zero carbon building standard has 425. So maybe we could use that as an alternative path, and or maybe even absolute limits. So again, the various different performance metrics are being considered, but the percent better than reference is the one that has been definitely agreed to, with the others to be investigated further. And then a tiered framework is one of the other clear directions that we've been given. You can see in the underline here that basically, similar to what Haley was saying, the idea of the tiered framework is that the bottom or the minimum tier should be easily achievable by a standard construction practice, but then as you go get lower carbon options, that's when you start moving up the tiers. There was also talks about potentially different tiers aligning with different scopes, right? So maybe it's a different tier aligned with the A to C and or MEP systems being included. So this, again, there's a few ways that the tier discussion could be taken, and it's not, again, 100% sorted. We still have some work to do on that, but having tiers is one of the mandatory policy direction levels that the group is going to be working through. And then, similar to the operational carbon, we have the same idea here in terms of reductions and graded performance levels. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do see chats coming through. We're going to hold for the discussion, or I see questions coming through. We'll have the discussion towards the end. So I'm not ignoring you, but we'll tackle that at the end. And then one of the other key things that came up from the comment period actually was that we needed to have, even though performance-based requirements is preferred, we thought there is a role for some prescriptive-based options for housing. So specifically for projects that don't have a big consulting team, that don't have a big budget, but they're housing projects, we want to be able to give them a potentially easier to implement way to show compliance. Things like maybe using a low carbon concrete, using a concrete below a certain threshold, or not having a basement. I'm riffing on these right now. These aren't official things, but those types of strategies, I think, are being considered as simple ways that homes, specifically small private homes, can meet embodied carbon requirements through simple prescriptive options. So again, would love to hear thoughts from people on that in future meetings and in any public comment periods. We also been given direction on flexibility for the North. Provinces and territories are responsible for adopting these in their own right, and we'll talk to that a little bit more. And then this is my last slide, because I do want to leave some time for Brian in a discussion, but this is just a link, which I think we can share after the call. But this is what the workspace looks like. If you get to this screen, this is what you want to subscribe to. This is where the agendas get posted. And I know Haley can also share invites, but this is open to everyone. So again, I won't take up any more of Brian's time, but just this is a warm invite for all of you to join these meetings, because we would love to hear from the rest of the industry and to be part of these discussions. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much. Appreciate that, Ryan. Very information heavy, but also I think very open to feedback. We're still early doors at trying to figure out what the correct embodied carbon measurement standards should look like for the National Building Code. And thanks for mentioning all the observer concerns that came up, because being part of some of those meetings, I think it's all valid. And at the end of the day, we need to kind of backtrack all our projects to look at how it fits into this framework. So I think just assessing the lift that will be required for us to get there versus aligning this in a way that's accessible to everyone, I think is going to be really important. And if you can drop the specific link where everyone can join those observer committees, I think that would be really useful. I'll pass it off now to Brian to kind of wrap it up with how everything that Ryan and Haley spoke about affects Ontario, and what it looks like for us harmonizing with the National Building Code and why that's important. So go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Mohammed. Excuse me. And thank you all for being here today and good afternoon. Just give me a minute to share my screen. And as Mohammed said, my role here is to kind of bottom line quickly, kind of what the implications are for Ontario, given that Ontario, as people will know, maintains its own code and does not automatically adopt changes to the national codes. So I get a provocative title here, Battle of Building Codes, just for fun, but it often feels like a battle, I think, for people in the industry who are many looking for more harmonization and simplicity. And of course, we're supposed to be moving in that direction, but progress has been uneven. So I'm going to start with just a brief context, and I think this has been largely covered and familiar to people, but the National Building Codes, both the NBC and the NECB, are federal, but they are essentially model codes for the provinces to adopt or draw from. Harmonization is encouraged, but not mandatory for provinces and territories. And we've just heard about 2025 code, national codes introducing operational carbon, as well as other important changes that have come with that. Great presentation on that today, so I won't rehash that. There's a little QR code here that leads to a blog post one of my staff wrote about the changes in the National Model Code and their implications for Ontario. So if you're curious, you can check that out to get some more thoughts on that. So building on that a little bit in the Ontario Building Code process, as most people will know, provinces have authority over building codes at their essentially sole discretion. However, the Ontario government has signed an agreement with the federal government called the Reconciliation Agreement on Construction Codes, which commits to working towards greater alignment between the Ontario Building Code and the national codes. As part of that, for example, Ontario committed to update the Ontario Building Code within 2 years of the 2020 National Code being published, and to do so in a way that increased the level of harmonization. And on future national code updates, including the 2025 code, which is now out, Ontario is committed to do it within 18 months of the federal update. However, those updates aren't required still to 100% align with national codes, only to further the cause of harmonization or reducing discrepancies. And so the most recent Ontario Building Code update was the 2025 edition. And that was done in time to meet the 2-year target for harmonizing with the 2020 National Code. That might sound like they didn't hit the 2-year target, but those who are monitoring know the 2020 National Code wasn't published until 2023. So Ontario just squeaked in terms of updating within the timeline that they'd agreed to increase harmonization. However, there was a lot of exceptions. In fact, over 700 pages of exceptions to the national codes in Ontario's 2025 code update. And that those exceptions and amendments included a complete exception of everything to do with energy and climate in the national codes. Which was different than what was consulted on. So for those who may have participated in the provincial consultation on the 2025 OBC update, the proposal for about a year of consultation was to harmonize on energy with Tier 1 of the NECB and I believe Tier 3 of the National Building Code, which would have kept Ontario energy efficiency requirements roughly equivalent to where they've been in the 2017 Ontario Building Code, but using the national framework and methodology. However, that decision was changed at the last minute. After the formal consultation had closed, there was an extensive, a couple of industry stakeholders really did an extensive lobbying campaign, essentially, and expressed opposition and concern with that harmonization. And that led to a last-minute decision that surprised a lot of folks to completely exempt the energy pieces of the national codes from the 2025 Ontario Building Code. So many of you will know this already, but yeah, Ontario continues to instead use SB 10, Special Bulletin 10 and 12, which are the 2017 Ontario Building Code energy efficiency requirements. Incidentally, that makes the 2025 Ontario Building Code was the first major building code update in Ontario in the last 20 years, I believe, not to include any increase in energy efficiency requirements. Usually we get maybe a 10% improvement each time, or 10 to 15. But they were frozen at the 2017 levels, excuse me. That means, of course, yeah, so it's completely divorced from national on energy. It does remain roughly equivalent to tier 1 of NECB and tier 3 of the NBC, although you can't technically say they're equivalent, as they use different methods in some areas. And it doesn't include any tiered performance requirements. There's only the level outlined in the 2017 building code supplementary documents. And there is a carbon requirement in there in SB10 as a modest one. It just essentially says the proposed building can't have higher greenhouse gas emissions than the code reference building if you're taking that performance pathway. However, if you know how that pathway works, that's not a very meaningful requirement. It would be hard to meet the energy requirements and have a higher emissions than the code reference building. So it's not in practice driving change, but there is a link to carbon in the code. Briefly, I'll say that was followed that update or over the similar period of time, there was a series of legislative amendments to also constrain municipal abilities to implement sustainability requirements, including on energy efficiency or carbon intensity through green development standards or similar frameworks. Three legislative bills that were partly aimed at restricting that, including Bill 98 is working through the legislature right now, which would further restrict green development standards, and we'll wait to see what municipal lawyers think. But certainly the province is clear that the intent of the bill is to eliminate any mandatory green development standards at the municipal level, and to make sure the only requirements on energy efficiency are those in the Ontario Building Code. So what's next for those? And this is, from a framework for those who are looking to see more harmonization with national codes. Ontario has until mid-2027 to update the Ontario Building Code to improve alignment with the 2025 National Building Code, if they're going to continue within the federal agreement framework they have. And we have, the province has said they're working towards an update by that timeline. So we expect some sort of update probably in 2027 to the Ontario Building Code. That will or is supposed to further harmonization, but there's no telling how far that will go. And it may or may not include harmonizing with any of the energy and carbon requirements in the national code. And so for those who are looking for a greater degree of harmonization, the way to express that is through direct advocacy at this stage to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, the Building Code branch, as well as the Minister's Office, letting them know your views on harmonizing with national or increasing that harmonization. And there will be most likely a formal consultation process once a proposal is drafted for that building code update, which will probably be posted through the Environmental Registry of Ontario. However, by the time that launches, most of the direction may be set. So those keen to influence Ontario's direction with that update would be well advised to reach out, before the launch of those consultations, before the end of this year, most likely, to express some of their priorities. And this is just further guidance for anyone who is looking to do that on behalf of their organizations that is looking for more harmonization. Basically, what I'll outline is the province has outlined its objectives for the next building code update. Those don't include energy efficiency or carbon reduction or climate change mitigation. So I wouldn't advise anyone looking for greater harmonization, including on those elements, to lead with the carbon and energy efficiency argument. The priorities that the province has outlined for the update are reducing interprovincial trade and labor mobility barriers. So that there's an argument that greater harmonization with national would help with that, making it easier for designers, suppliers, builders, trades to work across provincial boundaries. Another objective they've declared is speeding up housing delivery. So I think we can argue, or one could argue, that greater harmonization with national would also help with that, both through reducing those interprovincial trade barriers, but also just simplifying simplifying the process for people who work with building codes and enabling some of the more flexible housing and construction forms that National Code is working towards. And be specific. Just saying you want to see a greater degree of harmonization, probably not helpful, but let them know what you'd like to see harmonized. And if you'd like to see energy and carbon on the list of things to be harmonized with National Code, you should say that and iterate the importance of that to these broader objectives of improving the way our construction industry is working in Ontario. We've advocated and others have advocated for not just adopting one tier of the 2025 National Code requirements on energy and carbon, but adopting multiple tiers that would allow for something like a BC-style step code, which then municipalities could be that want to drive performance and have the market maturity to do that could be citing those higher tiers while staying within a national and provincial framework that's approved by the province. So we think that's a promising policy opportunity, although we're not sure if the province will be moving in that direction. They may just harmonize with one tier of the national codes. And so then the question will be, which tier is it? Because there are tiers, as you will know, that map to where code requirements in Ontario have been roughly since 2017. So which tier we harmonize with, or which tiers, if there is greater harmonization here, will be very important. And that said, I'm going to leave my presentation there and save the rest of the time for discussion and questions.
Sweet. Thanks so much, Brian. Appreciate that. And I think that last slide is super important because what we've seen, where we have seen success with communication with the provincial government is really aligning the carbon language with the national priority language. I think that's been super, super useful. Especially when it comes to embodied carbon, because we have proven that reduction in embodied carbon leads to a direct reduction in cost as an industry. So I think as we're developing the 2030 standards, I know it seems really far away, but as Brian has mentioned, it takes a while for provinces to align with a lot of amendments on national direction. So now is the right time to start this conversation about carbon in the context of affordability, of accelerating housing, etc. So thank you for that. And given now we have about 6 minutes left, happy to stay a bit longer if needed. I'll open up the chat for anyone who has any questions. We have some questions prepared, but I really want to hear from the audience and see if they have any comments or questions for this group. All right, I think Adam is asking if there are any provisions for retrofits in the 2025 NECB, similar to how 2025 National Building Code introduced a new part on the alterations to existing buildings. How does the NECB apply to existing buildings?
I can tackle that.
Yeah.
So it's parallel to how the NBC introduces it. So there's a new part in the NECB, Part 13, and it's very, very similar the way the requirements work between the two codes.
Cool. Are there any more questions? And feel free, if you have the access, to unmute yourselves and ask.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, the 2030 discussion on embodied carbon is focused on new buildings only, so it would not be applicable to existing buildings.
Yeah. I think I have a follow-up question to that, actually. So speaking of embodied carbon kind of coming in, and a challenge that we as builders have always had with building codes is like not enough like runway time to adapt to changes. So how would you say a builder now, or anyone, looking at it from a long term, can prepare for what the code will look like? Because we know what the basic outline is. We kind of know the scope and the scale at which the embodied measurements will be required. So what are some resources that people can access in order to kind of just internally start thinking about embodied carbon?
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing to do to get started is to start measuring your embodied carbon and understanding what that metric looks like, right? I think a lot of people still haven't done that. A lot have, but there's still a big part of the industry that has not done a whole building life cycle assessment. They haven't been collecting EPDs from their suppliers, and that's where we need to start, right? It's really that simple. You don't need to be super low carbon on your next building, but you need to be collecting the right data. You need to be asking for EPDs. You need to be understanding the total materials of each of your materials, and of your structure, at least starting with your structure. Again, we don't have to do the whole building at once, but for all your main structural elements, have the quantity. Talk to your supplier about getting an EPD. If you don't have that, find an industry average EPD from CLF. CLF publishes great baseline and benchmark numbers for industry averages of construction materials across Canada, and start there and understand where your numbers are. And because getting that data is not as easy as you might think. So just starting to have the discussions with your supply chain and building that into your standard practices, that would be the first thing to do. And then think about things that you can do to reduce things like minimizing underground construction. That means a lot less materials will be used on retaining walls and things like that. If we can shift our designs to be more above ground, it also reduces your risk of climate flooding, things like that. So it has an adaptation strategy as well. So there's lots that you can do to get started before these requirements come into place.
Awesome. And yeah, I'll drop in the chat the link to our kind of resource hub, which has rules of thumb, those rules of thumb that Ryan mentioned for reducing embodied carbon. It can be as qualitative as you want it to be. And if you measure it in the end and stack up to existing standards like the TGS, informally, I think that puts you in a really good place to kind of adopt those changes as they come. Does anyone else have any questions?
Who's planning to be an observer at the next meeting? Come on, I need to see some hands.
I
was gonna say it's lonely in there. We need some people, but it's not lonely. There's enough people, but we want more. We want more. So
Yeah.
please come to the next meeting. Hey, we got some thumbs up. Glad to see it.
Everyone's in it. A question for Haley. So when you guys looked at the operational carbon inclusion in the 2025 model and seeing that it's been adopted in some areas of the country and it's not been adopted in the other areas nationally, like what was that conversation like? Like how did you balance the need for this versus the actual I guess tools required to get there in terms of resources? I know we were at a good time economically when this was thought about, but now as we face more stringent economic pressures, we see that people are very resistant to change. If anything, they want to track back to traditional ways. So how do you balance that with introducing new metrics in the code?
I think the way the CBHCC is approaching this is through these tiered frameworks that they provide. So it is up to the province or territory to decide if they're going to adopt a tiered framework and which tier or which level they will adopt. And I think that's how it's being addressed, because, if one jurisdiction says, we're not ready for tier 2 energy efficiency, we're still at tier 1, that's totally possible within the framework. But if, another jurisdiction says, our electricity is very, very clean, and so we want to adopt the operational greenhouse gas emissions levels, and we're already level A because we're on hydro, that's totally possible too. So I think that is the approach.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was hoping you would highlight, is that at the end of the day, the National Building Code is a framework that can be adopted to any province as it's appropriate for them. I think there is a misconception as to, okay, if you don't you have to follow the framework word by word, but not really. Like as you've seen, Ontario made 711 changes to it before adopting it, which is a bit too much, but still it's something that's very malleable. Given that we are at time, I'm going to ask one last question, and this is going to be for Brian, just to round it off. How can municipalities, now that there have been new restrictions on municipalities when it comes to green standards, what role do they play now in sort of pushing the province forward? Because I think it's important to understand it's important to understand the dynamic here as it has changed a little bit throughout the last 12 months. So like, what does that look like in your opinion going forward?
Great question. So first I'll say, I mean, I will leave it to municipalities and their legal counsel to determine what elements, if any, of their kind of mandatory green standards they can maintain.
Yeah.
But certainly we expect to see that be quite limited for the near future. And so I think two things. One, of course, they can be an advocate with the provincial government to increase the level of ambition in the provincial building code and harmonization with national, bringing in operational carbon requirements, for example, as national is doing it with the current version.
Yeah.
The other thing that municipalities can do is maintain, many of them have a sort of second or multiple tiers in their green standards that they were applying. So they can, and some of them have incentives for building to those higher tiers. And so we'd like to see that maintained and enhanced. In fact, if we want to get support industry leaders and demonstrate the construction sector's capability to build high performance buildings, then having those stretch targets and incentives for them becomes even more important in the current environment. For example, City of Toronto, most well known with its development charge refund program for Tier 2 buildings. So we'd like to see that maintained and enhanced if possible. A couple of other cities have or are developing other frameworks for incentives for building to higher tiers. So again, we'd really like to see that maintained and enhanced. And then, of course, municipalities can always do more work to kind of streamline their zoning and planning requirements to better favor and enable low carbon or energy efficient design options. You know, some great work from the City of Toronto recently to sort of expand access to geothermal energy as an option, including on public right-of-way land. So things like that can make it easier to adopt energy efficient and low carbon technologies can remain to a certain extent within the municipal purview and align with the province's goal of sort of reducing what they see as red tape. So we can find red tape that blocks energy efficiency and climate action. And I think nobody's going to push back, hopefully, on cities eliminating some of that red tape.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think the idea of speeding up approval times is huge for us as developers. I think if you can pre-approve a package that's efficient and kind of have it speed up everything, that hits all those boxes that you showed in your slide. So hoping that continues happening. I was going to end it here, but Zara has a question on the chat, so maybe we can stay for a minute longer. Is there a way for the National Model Code to provide guidance on appropriate tiers for each region? So like adding guidance as appendix based on region size, industry capacity, circumstances, etc. I'll pass this to Haley to start.
So this has come up before. There have been questions in the past about energy tiers and the operational greenhouse gas levels. It's not exactly the right spot for it, I don't think, just based on what kinds of things normally go in the codes, even the appendix notes. It is up to the province or territory what they want to adopt. But NRC does have some research capacity if a province or territory wanted some assistance determining, you know, what's appropriate for our jurisdiction. That is an available path.
Yeah, and as an example of that, the Climate Smart Building Alliance, which includes like RBC, Mattamy, and the National Research Council and a few other entities, they are doing some work on what sort of the next steps in considering sustainability and affordability, like their operational carbon and embodied carbon, that total carbon inflection point, and there's a lot of research that is going on that's province-wide or even building type and municipality wide. So encourage everyone to reach out to the NRC if they have anything specific in mind for research. That's what they're here for. Okay, with that, we're 6 minutes over time. So thank you to everyone who stayed a couple minutes late, but we will end this for now. We will post the recording on our website. We'll send